Welcome back, everybody. Today, we're going to be doing a deep dive into what it actually means to be a human-centered leader.
Okay.
So,
Yeah.
going a little bit deeper than just the typical design principles, and
Yeah.
how to kind of be that in the real world.
Yeah.
Our guide for this deep dive is going to be the document Taking Action, Becoming a Human-Centered Leader.
It's a pretty good read. It really
Yeah.
dives into how this is not just something you can just do. It's really kind of like
Oh, yeah.
a fundamental shift in how you think
But
about leadership.
Okay, so we're not talking about just like, designing a human-centered product or service. We're talking about just like being
Yeah.
human-centered as a...
Being human-centered in how you lead.
Okay.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people are really looking for this kind of leadership these days. We see so much burnout and people just not feeling engaged at work.
Yeah.
And a real lack of connection.
Totally.
Like human-centered leadership is a really strong way to address that.
That's awesome. So let's paint a picture for our listeners here.
Mhm.
So let's say I'm working on a team with a true human-centered leader.
Mm.
What does that actually look and feel like day to day?
Yeah, so imagine you're in a project meeting and there's like a disagreement about the best way to proceed.
Okay.
Instead of, the leader just shutting down other opinions or imposing their own view, a human-centered leader would actually listen to everybody's perspective.
Right.
They'd ask questions to make sure they understand. They would really acknowledge how people are feeling and then guide the team to a solution that kind of takes care of everybody.
That sounds amazing. But, leaders also have to make really tough decisions sometimes under pressure.
Yeah.
So how does that work with human-centered approach in those really high-stakes situations?
Yeah, that's where that always be learning and growing part of this leadership style comes in.
Yeah.
Human-centered leaders are always asking for feedback and really looking at their own decisions and thinking, how can I be better? They know they have their own biases and limitations, and they're open to people disagreeing with them.
Yeah. So it's way more than just being nice or empathetic.
Right.
It's really like a full-on approach to leadership
Yeah.
that requires constant self-awareness.
You got it. It's a continuous journey.
Yeah.
And one thing the document brings up that I think people miss a lot is that a human-centered leader isn't just focused on their team, but on the bigger impact of their work.
So they're thinking about the people who use their product or service their customers,
Yeah.
the community, all the people affected by the decisions they make.
Exactly. They're always looking out for those needs and making sure the human element isn't lost in just trying to make money or meet deadlines.
Got it.
A really good example is Satya Nadella at Microsoft.
Oh, yeah. He's always held up as the model for this
Right.
type of leadership. But what did he actually do that made such a big difference?
Okay, so when Nadella became CEO, Microsoft was known for being really competitive, almost cutthroat inside the company.
Right.
And he really wanted to change that to a culture of empathy and collaboration.
Wow.
And one of the biggest things he did was this growth mindset initiative.
Oh, yeah. I've heard of that.
Yeah.
It was about encouraging employees to be open to learning and trying new things and even failing
Yeah.
as part of the process.
It was all about moving away from blaming people and being afraid to make mistakes
Interesting.
to being excited to learn and get better.
Cool.
And the results were pretty crazy.
Really?
Microsoft's stock price tripled under his leadership and people were way happier working there.
So this isn't just some nice idea. It really works.
Yeah.
Human-centered leadership can actually lead to big success in business.
Totally. And it doesn't have to be just big companies.
Yeah.
Think about a team leader who's always asking for feedback from users
Right.
and using that in their decisions. That's human-centered leadership too, just on a smaller scale.
That actually reminds me of a time when I was,
Yeah.
well, actually, maybe we should save that story for later.
Okay.
But it shows how this can really apply to any job.
Absolutely. The document says we can all be human-centered leaders no matter what our job title is.
That's awesome to hear.
Yeah.
But I have to admit, thinking about all of this empathy growth mindset, advocating for users' needs, it feels like a lot.
It can be a bit overwhelming at first.
Yeah.
But the cool thing about this is it's like a journey, not a destination.
Yeah.
And the document has some practical steps you can take to build these skills.
Okay, I'm ready. Lay it on me. What are the tools we need to start putting this into practice?
Well, it all starts with really listening to people, which most of us think we're good at, but we rarely actually do it.
You're right.
Yeah.
I know. I catch myself sometimes thinking about what I'm going to say next
Yeah.
instead of just focusing on what the other person is saying.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So how do we get better at listening? Think about a time when you felt like someone was really listening to you.
Yeah.
What were they doing? How did it make you feel? It's usually the small things like looking at you nodding, asking questions to make sure they understand.
Yeah.
It's about putting your own thoughts aside for a minute and just focusing on the other person.
And I guess that's more than just the words they're saying.
Yeah,
You're paying attention to their tone, how they're standing, how they're feeling.
exactly. Picking up on those little things that tell you more than words ever could.
So once you've listened and you understand the other person, then comes the empathy part.
Yeah.
How do we get better at that?
Well, there's lots of good exercises out there, but one that works really well is role playing.
Role playing? Okay, how would that work in a real situation?
Let's say you're launching a new product and there's a delay that's making your team frustrated.
Okay.
Instead of just sending an email explaining it, take some time to imagine you're one of them.
Okay.
How are they feeling? What are they worried about?
So you're not just giving them the facts, you're thinking about how they feel.
Right. And you can even take it a step further and try writing a letter from their point of view.
Yeah.
Like someone who's really affected by the delay.
Interesting.
This helps you connect with their emotions on a deeper level.
Yeah, I can see how that would help you be more empathetic.
Yeah.
It takes you out of your own head and makes you see things from their side.
Exactly. And that's the key to becoming a more human-centered leader.
Mm.
It's about moving from me to we.
I like that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's really interesting, that shift from me to we, because I think that's a big challenge for a lot of leaders, especially those who come from those, traditional top-down organizations.
Totally. I think that's one of the biggest things the document talks about.
Right.
Moving away from that command and control style to one where everybody feels like they have a say.
So how do you actually start to make that shift? Like, it's easy to read about it, but to really change how you act, especially when you're under pressure to get things done, that's got to be tough.
Yeah, it's definitely a process.
Right.
And I think it starts with building a culture where people feel comfortable speaking up, sharing their ideas, even disagreeing with you.
Like a safe space.
Exactly. Psychological safety. That's what they call it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Makes sense. But creating that kind of environment, it's got to be more than just saying, my door is always open.
Yeah.
You have to actually be willing to listen to value what other people think and even admit when you're wrong.
For sure. And it also means changing how you think about feedback.
Right.
Instead of seeing it as criticism, that human-centered leaders see it as a way to get better, both for themselves and the whole team.
Oh, that reminds me of this time I was working on a project and I got some really tough feedback from a coworker. And at first I was totally defensive,
Yeah.
but then I realized they were actually trying to help me improve the work.
Yeah.
And once I saw it that way, I was able to take their feedback and make some big changes that really made the project better in the end.
It's amazing how feedback can be a gift, even when it's hard to hear.
Yeah.
Good leader knows that everybody has blind spots and we can all learn from each other.
So it's about creating this loop where information's going back and forth, everyone's sharing, and you're all using that to get better.
Exactly. And another big part of that me to we're shift is giving people the power to take charge and lead themselves.
Yeah, I've seen so many teams where people are just waiting to be told what to do
Yeah.
instead of stepping up and coming up with their own solutions.
Yeah.
So how do you create that sense of ownership? Like they have the power to make things happen.
It all starts with trust.
Mm-hmm.
You have to trust your team to make decisions and take risks, even if they mess up sometimes.
But what about accountability? Like if you're giving people more freedom,
Yeah.
how do you make sure things still get done?
Well, that's where having clear goals and expectations comes in.
Right.
You got to be super clear about what the team is trying to achieve and what each person's role is.
Yeah.
And then you got to give them the space to figure out how to get there.
So you're setting the big picture, but not micromanaging every little detail.
Exactly. You're there to support and guide them, but you're also letting them learn and grow on their own.
That sounds like a tricky balance to get right.
It is, but it's so powerful for both the leader and the team.
I can imagine. Okay, so we've talked a lot about the inside stuff of human-centered leadership, but I'm curious about how this affects the actual things companies make, like the products and services. How do you make sure you're really meeting the needs of the people who use those things?
That's where human-centered design comes in.
Okay.
It's about really understanding your users, what they need, what motivates them, what their problems are.
So is that just about doing interviews and surveys with them?
Those are definitely important tools, but it's also about going deeper than that and really immersing yourself in their world.
Interesting.
Like watching them in their normal environment, shadowing them as they do their everyday tasks, even trying to use your own products the way they would.
That takes a lot of humility, being willing to step outside your own bubble and see things from their perspective.
For sure. And you have to be ready to be surprised by what you find.
Yeah.
A lot of times what we think users want is totally off base.
I've been in so many meetings where we were convinced we had the perfect solution,
Yeah.
only to find out later that it completely missed the mark for the people who are actually going to be using it.
Exactly. That's why it's so important to keep users involved throughout the entire design process, from brainstorming ideas to testing and refining the final product.
So it's not just about getting feedback at the end, it's about having that constant conversation and working together the whole time.
Exactly. And being willing to adapt and change course based on what you learn from your users.
You know, all this talk about user needs and feedback
Yeah.
makes me think about the other people involved in a project,
Mm-hmm.
like the bosses, the investors, everyone who has a stake in it. How does a human-centered leader balance all those interests that sometimes might be pulling in different directions?
That's a really good question.
Yeah.
And honestly, it's one of the toughest things about this leadership style.
Right.
Because sometimes what users need and what the business needs don't line up. So how do you handle those tricky situations? It's about empathy and transparency, understanding where everyone's coming from and being honest about the compromises that need to be made.
Yep.
And as much as possible, getting everyone involved in the decision making.
So it's all about communication and collaboration.
Exactly. It's about finding solutions that work for as many people as possible.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And that takes us back to that idea of shared leadership we were talking about.
Exactly. It's recognizing that everyone has a part to play in creating a world that puts people first.
And it's not just on the leader, it's about everyone working together. The whole team, the organization, even the community.
Absolutely. It's about creating a culture where everyone feels like they can make a difference.
So it's not just changing how we lead, it's changing how we work, how we treat each other, and how we face the challenges we all have.
You got it. It's a fundamental shift in how we think and act,
Yeah.
and something we can all work towards no matter what our job is.
Okay, now we've been talking about all the good things about human-centered leadership, but I think we should also be real about the challenges that come with it.
Totally. Nothing worth doing is ever easy.
Yeah.
And this is no different.
So what are some of the hurdles people might face when they're trying to become this type of leader?
Well, one of the biggest is simply time.
Yeah.
It takes time to build relationships, to really listen to people, to get their feedback, and to think about what you're doing.
Especially these days when everyone's so busy and feeling the pressure to do more with less.
Exactly. And it can be tempting to cut corners or to prioritize getting things done quickly over being empathetic.
But I feel like that can backfire on you
Totally.
because you can end up losing the things that make human-centered leadership work in the first place.
You're right. And that's why it's so important to make time for these things, even when you're swamped.
So it has to be a priority, not just something you do if you have a few minutes left over.
Exactly. And another challenge is that it often requires a shift in the whole company culture.
Yeah, I can see how that could be a huge obstacle
Yeah.
because it's not just about changing how one person acts, it's about changing the whole system.
Right. And that can be a long and tough process, especially in companies that are stuck in the old ways of doing things.
But it sounds like it's necessary if you really want to create a workplace that puts people first.
It is. And it takes leadership from the top, but everyone in the company needs to be on board.
So it's not just the CEO, it's everyone feeling like they can contribute to the change.
Exactly. And another challenge you often hear is that this style of leadership is too soft or touchy-feely.
Yeah, I've heard that too. People saying things like, we don't have time for all this empathy stuff. We got to focus on making money.
But the truth is, human-centered leadership is anything but soft. It takes a lot of courage, vulnerability, and resilience.
Because you're putting yourself out there.
Yeah.
You're asking for feedback. You're making choices that might not make everyone happy.
Right. And you're also shaking things up, which some people don't like.
But I think being uncomfortable often means you're growing.
Totally.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why it's so important to create an environment where people feel safe to try things out, make mistakes, and learn from them.
So it's about building a culture of constant learning and improvement.
Exactly. And finally, one of the biggest challenges is figuring out how to measure the impact of human-centered leadership.
Yeah, I can see how that would be tough.
Yeah.
It's hard to put numbers on things like empathy, trust, and teamwork.
Right. And it can be tempting to just focus on traditional things like how much work gets done or how much profit you make.
But that feels like you're missing the bigger picture.
You are.
Yeah.
Because the real impact of this style of leadership is often in things you can't easily measure, like how engaged people are, how creative they are, and how much they come up with new ideas.
And those are the things that lead to success in the long run.
Absolutely. So we got to find ways to measure those, even if it takes some creativity.
So it's about looking beyond the numbers and paying attention to the human side of things.
Exactly. That's what human-centered leadership is all about.
It seems like so much of what we've talked about comes down to like a totally different way of thinking about what a leader is.
Yeah.
It's not about being the one with all the answers or always being in charge.
Right.
It's more about helping others step up and work together and creating a place where everybody feels valued.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And honestly, I think it's about time we made this change. For too long, we've been stuck in this old way of leading that's all about control and power and never showing any weakness.
And it's not working out so well, is it? I mean, look around. There's burnout. People aren't engaged. Nobody trusts institutions and organizations anymore.
Exactly. And that's why I'm so hopeful about this human-centered leadership thing.
Yeah.
I think it has the potential to create a better future for all of us.
Me too. But we got to be real. Change doesn't happen overnight. It takes work and a willingness to really challenge those old habits and beliefs that are so ingrained.
You're right. It's going to take all of us. Leaders need to make space for this to happen, but everyone in an organization has to be willing to try new ways of working and interacting.
So it's not just changing how we lead, it's changing the whole culture, how we think, and what we value as a group.
Exactly. And that's why this document we've been talking about, Taking Action, Becoming a Human-Centered Leader, is so helpful.
Right.
It's not just theory, it actually gives you tools and exercises to start making this shift.
So for our listeners who are ready to take that first step, what's the most important thing for them to remember?
Be kind to yourself. This is a journey. There's no finish line. You're going to mess up. You're going to run into roadblocks. You're going to have moments where you doubt yourself.
Right.
But that's all part of it. The key is to keep learning, keep growing, and keep trying to be the best leader you can be.
That's such good advice.
Yeah.
And I think it applies to way more than just leadership. It's how we should approach life in general. Be kind to yourself, embrace the tough stuff, and never stop learning.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive.
Yeah, it's been an awesome conversation. And I hope our listeners are leaving with some good ideas and maybe some inspiration to start putting these human-centered ideas into their own work and lives.
Me too. Remember, even small changes can have a big impact. So start where you are, use what you've got, and don't be afraid to try new things and learn as you go.
And hey, maybe one of our listeners will be the next Satya Nadella or Jacinda Ardern, inspiring everyone to build a more human-centered world.
Wouldn't that be great?
Yeah.
Thanks for joining me for this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure. Until next time, keep diving deep and keep leading from the heart.